Okay, so I'm really thrilled to welcome Kay to Festillit to talk about her first novel, which I have here, Then a Wind Blew. And although Kay is a debut novelist, she has had a career in publishing both in the UK and in Zimbabwe. And so in Zimbabwe, she actually founded a publishing house that published things like the Encyclopedia of Zimbabwe and the memoirs of the former head of intelligence, which I'm imagining Kay might have been a bit toe curling to publish. She's also published a non-fiction book, a very successful guide to the use of English in the workplace called What Not to Write. And that's now in its 9th edition. As I say, Then a Wind Blew is her first foray into fiction. Kay splits her time between the UK and the Tarn, and she's joining us now from there. And she's in the same village as our second guest, Robin Ellis, who is best known, of course, as the original Ross Poldark and who made a return as the Reverend House in the remake a few years ago. And who, apart from that, has also had a very long and successful career on stage and TV. So Robin also lives, although he lives full-time in the Tarn, and people who've been with us for many years at Festillit will remember him coming on our second year and giving us a demonstration, a cookery demonstration, because Robin now writes cookery books and teaches cooking on the Mediterranean diet. So Robin is going to be reading from Kay's book a bit later on. So thank you both very much. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for your time. Kay, maybe if we start with you, could you just tell us a little bit about the novel's background and kind of historical setting, just for those of us whose history, like mine, is a little bit rusty?
Okay. The country that became known as Rhodesia was set up by Cecil John Rhodes, who gave the country his name, under something called the British South Africa Company, approved by London. Lord Salisbury was the Prime Minister at the time, and hence the name Salisbury of the capital when the country was called Rhodesia. The BSA company ruled the country till 1923, and then London gave Britain self-governing status, and that went on right up through to independence. In 1953, the country formed what was called the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, with Northern Rhodesia, which is now Zambia, and Nyasaland, which is now Malawi. But that lasted 10 years only, because by then Macmillan's famous, wind of change was blowing across Africa. The African nationalist movements were growing everywhere. Former African British colonies were getting independence. What became Zambia wanted its independence, and so did Malawi. So the federation broke up because Southern Rhodesia, as it was then, did not want independence on the same terms as the other countries were getting independence. Basically, it wanted to persist with white rule. So there followed a long series of negotiations with the British Prime Minister, mostly Harold Wilson at the time, which broke down. And eventually, in 1965, Ian Smith, the Prime Minister, declares Unilateral Declaration of Independence, UDI. From then on, in the early 60s, there'd been a lot of, the growth of the African nationalist movement had been quite strong, and there was sabotage and arson. A lot of the leaders were imprisoned, some of them for up to 10 years. By the late 60s, things were beginning to get quite worrying. The British government tried again through what was called the Peace Commission to bring some reconciliation to this. That didn't work. Many of the leaders that had been imprisoned were released in 1974. The war was essentially operating from the guerrilla war from Zambia at that point, but it was pretty low key. Then big change, 1975, Mozambique becomes independent, and the new president there, Samora Machel, offers Mozambique as a base for the guerrilla war. So the camps were set up there, and then the war really takes off. At that point, you've got a country where the number of white people were about 250,000. The number of Black people were 6 million. So the guerrilla war is never really going to be defeated. Most guerrilla wars aren't, and this one certainly wasn't. And the outside world began to try to persuade Smith, look, you cannot win this war. He persisted. He said, yes, I can. We've got air power. They haven't, etc., etc. But eventually, towards the end, the Rhodesian government was throwing everything they could at the guerrilla forces, massive bombing raids, and there was an element of chemical biological warfare and all that sort of thing. But clearly the game was up, and the only way out of this was peace talks, which Lord Carrington convened at Lancaster House. Agreement was reached. Elections were held. That was in late 79, and then elections were held February, March 1980. Independence in April, and Mugabe comes to power. Mugabe won a landslide victory. The Rhodesian government wasn't prepared for that, but interestingly, neither was London prepared for that. Anyway, he won a resounding victory and came into power. And my novel is set in that final sort of year of the war, when things were at their worst, really.
Great. Thanks, Kay. So thanks. So you've given us a great historical setting. I wonder, before I start asking you questions about why you wrote the book and the themes you treat within it, I wonder maybe if we might go to Robin for a reading, so that we could, we've had the historical context, an introduction. Perhaps we could really hear a bit of the novel, so we can situate ourselves in that. So Kay, I think you were maybe just going to tell us where we are in the story before Robin reads.
So the background to what Robin's going to read, most of my story is set in the northeast of the country, which was the worst area really when it came to the fighting, and particularly in the rural areas, they were ravaged by the war. The story moves from a chrome mine to a Christian mission nearby, and to a valley between the two, in which there were a lot of villages and what used to be called an African reserve, areas of the country that were set aside where Africans had to live and no whites could live, etc., etc. So elements of apartheid there. The manager of this chrome mine is Reg Haig. His wife is Susan Haig. They came out to the country in 1950 from Britain, like a lot of people did. They have 2 sons. One has by this time been killed in the war. The other one is unfit for duty. He's been sent home because he, couldn't handle the war. So that's the background to where we are with what Robin's going to read.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kay. Robin, over to you.
Reg loved his classical music, and because Susan didn't, she preferred musicals. He'd play it when she wasn't at home. He'd open the gramophone, put on an LP, and turn the volume up high. She knew this because sometimes she'd come home earlier than expected, and he'd be there on the veranda, leaning forward with a smile on his face, looking out across the garden, or with his eyes closed, conducting. And so it was today. She heard the music when she got out of the car to unlock the gates. And when she reached the house, there he was, on the veranda, arms waving about. Reg was a big man, burnt brown from all those years in the sun, a manly man. And she always thought he looked rather silly, waving his arms about like that. He turned the music down as she came up the steps onto the veranda. The rays of the evening sun were streaming in through the bougainvillea creeper at the far end of it. Is that something new? It sounded a bit churchy, not the type of thing he usually played. Yes, he said, and no. He lifted the gramophone arm, took up the LP, dusted it, and put it back in its sleeve. Well, what, dear? What is it? What are you playing? Not really your cup of tea, dear. None of it is much, you know that, but you could tell me what it is. He sipped his beer. Something Beth mentioned the other day, Tallis. Years since I've listened, knew I had it somewhere, dug it out. Sublime. Had forgotten just how sublime. Beth Lytton, the nun at St. Anselm Mission. That explained the churchiness. Reg went out to St. Anselm sometimes, ostensibly to see if all was well, especially with terrorist attacks on missions on the increase. But Susan knew it was as much about listening to classical music with Beth as it was about being a good neighbor. Good turnout at the clinic? Very, Susan said. She went down the corridor to bathe and change, and then came back to the veranda, sat, and took a cigarette from Rech's packet. Philemon appeared with the drinks tray, G&T for her, another lager for Reg. She lit her cigarette, inhaled, and blew out a plume of smoke and a long sigh. Why can't she be sensible and go into the city? Who? Beth Lytton, living out there alone. It's asking for trouble. Reg picked up the binoculars and fixed them on a hoopoo that had landed at the far end of the garden near the whitethorn tree. A white woman sitting in an African reserve, crawling with terrorists, sticking out like a sore thumb. A stubborn woman, causing people a lot of worry. You, for a start. The hoopoo flew up, and Reg followed it with binoculars. Beth's not alone, he said. The Zabandas, the other nuns, plenty of other people there. Not the same, Susan thought. All African people. So not the same at all. Not people she could rely on, people who'd defend her when the terrorists showed up at her door, looking for another European missionary to murder.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Robin. So now we're really situated historically and atmospherically in the book, Kay. Can I ask you, first of all, why you wanted to write about this period and this topic? What was it that really motivated you?
Well, first of all, I long wanted to write, try fiction, having sort of done so many other bits in publishing. So, and I was fairly certain that once I got round to it, it would be Zimbabwe or Africa at least. That was where my heart was. And also, quite separate from this, watching the Syrian war develop, from 2012 onwards, I began to be much more aware of what happened to women in war, and that became more and more of an interest. And I sort of thought about that in terms of Zimbabwe and how little we knew really about the women in that war. And the second reason was my daughters were born in Zimbabwe at the time of the war, and they'd grown up asking me a lot of questions about it. They've lived most of their life in England, and I never really felt able to answer. So the book was a way of making up for that and giving them the picture with all its nuances. So those are the main reasons why.
And was there something that triggered it more than, triggered you to write the book now? Was that really seeing the Syrian conflict? Or was there something else that really made you think, now is the time that I'm going to really try this?
There's just one word for that, Liz, retirement.
Okay, a nice word.
Yeah, no, but towards the end of my publishing career, I got into working as a consultant for an ebook company for a tech company that wanted to get into ebooks. They were on the horizon, and they wanted somebody in the publishing world to help them get into that world. So I did, and I worked with them for a few years, but my heart wasn't really in ebooks, and I thought I want to chuck this in, and then I thought I'm going to chuck work anyway and start writing. So I did. Yeah.
Excellent. Great. And I'm interested, so you lived through some of this. I'm interested in what writing the novel did to your memories of that period.
Memories played a part in my writing of it, but I needed, there was so much I didn't know, and the more I thought about it, the more, I'd done a lot of, not just having been there for some years in the war, but also I was involved in a lot of publications after the war that had to do with it. But I just felt I still didn't really know, and I couldn't rely on memory. I wanted to, do as much research as I possibly could to see what sort of story I might get out of this. And of course, I learned a huge amount. I hadn't realized how little I'd known about the war.
So what kind of research did you do? How did you go about that?
Well, I met and corresponded with a lot of people who I knew had done research on the period. One of them was a real treasure chest. Her name was Marian Shlovu, and she's a historian. She'd been in the Zambian camps during the war, and after the war, she'd interviewed women, dozens of women that had been in the camps during the war. And so we had these verbatim interviews that she gave me, which was absolutely wonderful, because clearly that was a side of the war that I had no firsthand experience of. And then there were a couple of other, there were many others who that I could get that aspect of the war from. Another one was Irene Mudeka, who did a study of female guerrillas. And then a Zimbabwean historian called Gerald Mazariri, who did a study, a wonderful piece called Discipline and Punishment in the camps. And that helped an awful lot for me to get this idea of what life was like in the camps. Then I combed the net for memoirs, people both sides putting up their memoirs. So I wanted to read, I think most of all I wanted to read as much first-hand stuff as I possibly could. So I read that. I read everything I could. I had myself again. I sat in the British Library for a couple of years, read everything I could find there. Non-fiction, memoirs, biographies. You mentioned the memoir that I was involved in. That was the Ken Flower memoir. He'd been the head of intelligence from 64 to 81, 82. And he came to me asking for help to write the memoir, which that took a couple of years. And of course, it took me behind closed doors in a way that telling me things I had never imagined could be true. And I published that book with John Murray in London in 1987. And I went back to that book. I went back to my notes, that I'd taken when I was doing all that. Fiction, particularly African writers, because again, I needed to get more of the African perspective on this. Journals, one of the best is the Journal of Southern African Studies. I got a lot of material there. Newspaper articles, yeah. So quite a lot. I just sunk myself in it for a couple of years.
Yeah.
And quickly built up my knowledge of the seeing the war from a guerrilla camp, as it were, and obviously a lot of it was tough reading. And then after 2 years of researching, I began to mold the story. I started writing in the third year and finished it in the fourth year. And then I sent my draft to a very successful author friend and said, would she read it? And she said, okay, what draft is it? And I said, first. And she said, not interested. Come back to me when it's the third or the fourth. So I went away, and sort of 6 months later, I sent her the 5th draft, and that was okay.
Did you get any input from other people between the 1st and the 5th draft, or did you just keep going back to it and changing it?
Not really, no. I wasn't really I was still doing a bit of research, a bit of reading, and new things would come up all the time, and I'd go and look, and that would lead you onto something else, but not really corresponding with people as such at that point, no.
Okay. And can you give us an example maybe of something that you learnt in the research that maybe really challenged your memories and experiences and some of the assumptions that you'd had about the war?
I'm not sure that they challenged my experiences, my memories so much. It was more that, I just gained so much knowledge and more understanding, and I could understand the context of the war. I saw it as a more coherent thing than I had before. My memories were very patchy, very fragmented, so much more what made sense. Even though I sort of thought I knew a lot about it, I didn't. It made a lot more sense when I went back to it this time.
Okay. So, I mean, one of the things that really interests me, Kay, is, I mean, we've all seen, through the news over the years, how Mugabe's rule impacted Zimbabwe. And I wonder how you were able to write about the war and about the kind of push for independence, without being influenced by that hindsight. I mean, was it a struggle to divorce what you know now from the past and the writing in any way?
Not really, for those years when I was researching, I really immersed myself in the time. I went back, I lived there. So yes, I was learning a lot more doing that than I had at the time, but I don't really feel that hindsight came into it, very much. What was more interesting to me in a way was to discover how much of the then explained the now. When Mugabe came to power, there was a lot of hope that this country, this jewel of a country, would go back to ordinary life, ordinary things happening, ordinary development. And I think what a lot of people overlooked, and certainly I did, was that Mugabe and the people who took over power had been through a very long war, as well as imprisonment, etc. And to fight that war, they'd had to have very strict discipline, etc., all of that sort of thing. So that when they came to power, having never ruled before, there was a mindset of discipline, of punishment for straying, of all of that. And in some ways, that hasn't sort of left them, it got deeper and deeper the more that his power seemed to be threatened. So he reverted to this mindset. And sadly, it's still a bit like that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So can you tell us a bit more about the characters in the novel? I mean, I'm interested, everyone always asks this question, to what extent were they based on people you know, and to what extent are they fictional creations? But, to answer that, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about them.
Okay. Most of them are probably composites of people I knew. If I take Susan, for example, she is the voices of women on my mother's veranda, who would come and have tea and chat and talk about servants and politics and whatever. So growing up, I picked up a lot of that, and their views became pretty entrenched by the time the war was actually on. Then there are a few characters that are loosely based on somebody I knew quite well, and one of those is Beth, the nun at the mission. I picked up, I modeled my Beth on that person, and a lot of what that person's life was like in the mission, at the mission during the war, I used that in the novel, some bits of that. And then one of my main characters is completely invented, Nyanyi. I didn't know anybody like Nyanyi, or I didn't model it on anybody. I knew somebody like her sister in the novel, Kundiso. I knew her very well. And I wanted them, they were twin sisters, and I wanted Nyanyi to be the sort of opposite of Kundiso, who was feisty and chatty and resolute and dived into everything head first. So Nyanyi, and very quite stocky. Nyanyi was tall and elegant, Nyanyi was quiet, and Nyanyi was more circumspect. So that was how I gradually built her up. But she was a complete invention.
Okay, it's just worth saying for those who haven't read the book yet that these two sisters are in the guerrilla camps. I mean, they are involved in the war, in the fight in the guerrilla camps, aren't they? So so that's another thing I wanted to ask you actually, is because your protagonists, your three main female protagonists, are on both sides of the war. So tell me a little bit about that choice you made and why that was important to you.
To get the spectrum, the political spectrum, that's what I wanted. I wanted a book that, you could see the story of the war from as many angles as I could find. So I had those three main women, the Rhodesian white woman. She's not necessarily typical, but it's just that there were a lot of people like her. The guerrilla, African guerrilla angle, and in the middle, as a sort of foreigner in the country, was the English nun, who could see both sides, lived both sides. And a lot of my other people, I had some whites you could call racist, some that you couldn't, etc., etc. There were blacks likewise. I tried to cover as many angles as possible, because I'm tired in wars of people seeing wars as sort of black and white. They aren't, they never are. It's all grays. So that's what I wanted to achieve. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, I have some more questions, Kay, but I'm going to open up now to the audience. I always tend to do this. I tend to have hogged you and asked you lots of questions. So I'm going to open up now and see if anyone else has questions, and then I'll come back at the end to ask you a couple more if that's okay. So I'm just going to pause recording in case anybody's really a bit shy about being on the recording.